freezing night, a crushed Mercedes in a ravine, and a bleeding woman whispering, "Don't call the cops. They'll finish the job." A struggling single father thought he was just saving a dying stranger. He had no idea he had just rescued a billionaire CEO, painting a target on his own back. The relentless Seattle rain had turned to a bitter, blinding sleet by the time David Miller's shift ended. At 32, David was a man carved out of exhaustion. The heater in his beat-up 2008 Ford F-450 tow truck barely worked, sputtering lukewarm air against the freezing windshield. Pinned to the dashboard, illuminated by the faint green glow of the instrument panel, was a past-due eviction notice and a medical bill from Seattle Children's Hospital. His 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, needed specialized asthma medication, and his meager salary as an independent tow truck driver for the county barely kept the lights on, let alone covered the astronomical costs of American healthcare. It was 2:00 a.m. on a desolate stretch of Route 90 near Snoqualmie Pass. The police dispatcher had already called it a night for any non-emergency tows, leaving the winding mountain roads deserted. David was listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic thwack-thwack of his windshield wipers when his headlights caught something unnatural. A heavy set of tire tracks veered violently off the wet asphalt, plowing through the reinforced steel guardrail. The metal was sheared clean, twisted like a discarded candy wrapper, disappearing into the pitch-black abyss of the forested ravine below. David slammed on the brakes. The truck fishtailed before coming to a heavy stop. He grabbed his high-powered maglite and stepped out into the biting cold, the sleet stinging his cheeks like glass shards. Walking to the edge of the broken guardrail, he shined the beam down. 50 feet below, nestled in a grave of splintered pine trees and jagged rocks, rested the mangled remains of a black Mercedes G-Class. Smoke hissed from the crumpled hood, barely visible through the downpour. "Hey!" David yelled into the darkness. Only the howling wind answered. Instinct took over. Before his wife passed away 3 years ago, David had served as a combat medic in the Army. He grabbed his first aid jump bag and a heavy coil of rope from the flatbed. Tying one end to his winch, he rappelled down the steep, muddy embankment. The mud was slick, grabbing at his boots, nearly sending him tumbling into the darkness. When he reached the bottom, the smell of gasoline and copper blood flooded his senses. The driver's side of the SUV was completely caved in. He peered through the shattered window. Pinned against the steering column, unconscious and covered in blood, was a woman. She was pale, dressed in a torn, soaking wet silk blouse that spoke of money David had only seen in movies. A deep laceration across her temple bled profusely, and her breathing was shallow, ragged. Miss, can you hear me?" David reached through the broken glass, pressing 2 fingers to her icy neck. Her pulse was thready. She was slipping into severe hypothermia and hemorrhagic shock. With a groan, the woman's eyelids fluttered. Striking, piercing blue eyes, clouded with pain, found David's face. "I'm getting you out of here," David said, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I need an ambulance and a rescue crew at mile marker." A cold, trembling hand shot out, her bloody fingers gripping his wrist with a desperate, terrifying strength. "No," she rasped, coughing violently. Blood flecked her pale lips. "No police. No hospitals. Lady, you're bleeding out. Your car is crushed. You need a trauma center. They cut the brake lines," she whispered, her eyes wide with a profound waking terror. "If you call them, he'll know I'm alive. He'll finish it, please." David froze. The radio hummed with static. He looked at the sheared guardrail above, then back at her. The angle of the crash, the way the car hadn't skidded but launched, it wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to murder her. If he called it in, whoever did this would hear it on the scanner. But if he took her, he was aiding and abetting, breaking the law and risking his own life and Chloe's. "Please," she breathed, a single tear cutting through the blood on her cheek before her eyes rolled back and she passed out. David cursed under his breath. He couldn't leave her to die in the freezing mud. Using his crowbar, he wrenched the jammed door open. The metal groaned and gave way. He carefully unbuckled her, supporting her neck, and pulled her limp body from the wreckage. She was shockingly light. He threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and began the agonizing, grueling climb back up the muddy ravine. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed in the freezing air, but the thought of his little girl waiting for him at home fueled his steps. He laid her gently in the passenger seat of his truck, cranking the broken heater as high as it would go, wrapping her in his heavy, oil-stained winter coat. He patched her head wound with gauze and pressure from his kit, stabilizing her neck. As he drove away, leaving the silent wreckage behind in the dark, David checked his rearview mirror. No flashing lights, no headlights. Just him, a dying stranger, and a secret that was about to turn his fragile world upside down. David lived in a cramped, two-bedroom trailer on the outskirts of the city. The roof leaked when it rained hard, and the floorboards creaked, but it was filled with Chloe's colorful crayon drawings and the warmth of a home held together by sheer willpower. When he carried the unconscious woman inside, laying her carefully on his worn-out living room sofa, the magnitude of what he had done finally hit him. He was harboring a potential fugitive, or worse, the target of a hitman. He quickly locked the door and pulled the cheap blind shut. For the next 8 hours, David fell back into his military training. He cleaned and sutured the deep gash on her forehead with a sterilized needle and thread from his kit. He checked for broken ribs. She had 3 fractured, but not displaced. He started an IV line using saline bags he kept in his emergency stash, rehydrating her and battling the hypothermia with thick blankets and a space heater pulled close to the couch. Morning broke, casting a gray, dreary light through the gaps in the blinds. Chloe padded out of her bedroom, clutching her stuffed rabbit, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She stopped, staring at the woman on the couch with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy?" Chloe whispered. "Is she an angel? She fell from the sky." David sighed, running a hand over his exhausted, stubble-covered face. "No, sweetie. She was in a bad accident. We're keeping her safe for a little while, but it's a secret, okay? Just between us." Chloe nodded solemnly, immediately fetching a small knitted blanket from her room and draping it over the stranger's feet. At noon, the woman finally woke up. She gasped, shooting up from the cushions, but the sharp pain in her ribs made her cry out, forcing her back down. Her eyes darted around the dingy, dimly lit trailer, taking in the water stains on the ceiling, the humming old refrigerator, and finally David, who was sitting in a recliner with a cup of black coffee. "You're safe," David said quietly, keeping his hands visible to show he wasn't a threat. "You're in my home, outside the city." She touched the stitches on her forehead, wincing. You saved me. I pulled you out of a ditch. You told me not to call the cops. I hope to God I didn't make a mistake." David leaned forward. "Who are you? And who is trying to kill you?" The woman hesitated. Her mind raced. She was Victoria Sterling, the 28-year-old CEO and majority shareholder of Sterling Bancroft Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar global shipping empire. The day before, she had uncovered massive embezzlement within her own executive board, orchestrated by her own uncle, Richard Sterling. She had confronted him, threatening to take the files to the FBI. Hours later, her brakes failed on the mountain pass. If Richard knew she survived, he wouldn't stop until she was in the ground. She couldn't trust anyone, especially not this impoverished stranger, no matter how kind his eyes seemed. "My name is Sarah," she lied smoothly, her voice raspy. I was running from an abusive ex-boyfriend. He tampered with my car. I'm sorry to drag you into this. I'll leave as soon as I can stand." David studied her. He knew a lie when he heard one, but he also saw the genuine, raw terror in her eyes. "You're not walking anywhere with 3 fractured ribs and a concussion, Sarah. You'll stay here until you're healed. But if trouble comes knocking on my door, I have a daughter to protect. You understand?" "I understand," Victoria whispered. For the next 3 days, Victoria remained hidden in the trailer. She watched David quietly from the couch. She saw him wake up at 4:00 a.m. every day to go drive his truck, returning late at night covered in grease, only to patiently sit and help Chloe with her math homework. She saw him skip dinner twice so Chloe could have second helpings of mac and cheese. She saw the stack of past-due bills on the kitchen counter, realizing that the man who saved her life was drowning in poverty. On the fourth evening, the truth blew the doors off her fragile lie. David was in the kitchen fixing a cheap canned soup. The ancient box television in the corner was tuned to the local news. The anchor's voice cut through the quiet hum of the trailer. Breaking news tonight out of Seattle. The search has been called off for billionaire tech and logistics heiress, Victoria Sterling. Authorities have officially declared her presumed dead after her vehicle was found at the bottom of a ravine off Route 90 earlier this week. The body was not recovered, swept away by the river currents, police theorize. David stopped stirring the soup. The spoon clattered against the rim of the pot. The broadcast flashed a high-resolution corporate portrait of Victoria. She was wearing a ruthless, sharp designer suit. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, those same piercing blue eyes staring back at the camera. In the wake of this tragedy, the board of Sterling Bancroft Logistics has held an emergency vote, appointing her uncle, Richard Sterling, as the new permanent CEO. David slowly turned his head, looking from the television screen to the woman sitting on his lumpy, thrift store sofa wearing one of his oversized flannel shirts. Victoria's face was pale, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She stared at the screen, her chest heaving as she watched her uncle, the man who had cut her brake lines, feign tears at a press conference. David walked over, picked up the TV remote, and clicked it off. The silence in the trailer was deafening. "So," David said, his voice dangerously calm, "an abusive ex-boyfriend? Huh?" Victoria looked up at him. The mask of a frightened, helpless victim fell away, replaced by the calculating, hardened gaze of a CEO who commanded thousands. "I had to be sure I could trust you," she said, her voice entirely different now, steady, commanding, yet carrying an edge of desperation. "You lied to me," David said, angry now. "You brought a billionaire corporate assassination plot into my house, where my little girl sleeps. If I told you who I was, you would have turned me in for the reward money. Or worse, Richard's men would have found you." Victoria forced herself to stand, ignoring the blinding pain in her ribs. She walked toward him, stopping inches away. "David, my uncle orchestrated this. He's liquidating my father's legacy to cover up a billion-dollar fraud scheme. If I walk into a police station right now, his people on the payroll will make sure I have an aneurysm in the holding cell." David rubbed his temples, feeling a massive headache coming on. "So what is the plan, Victoria? Because you can't hide in a trailer in South Seattle forever." "I don't need forever," Victoria said, a cold fire burning in her eyes. "I just need 3 weeks. The annual shareholder proxy vote is on the 28th. If I can walk into that boardroom, alive, with the encrypted flash drive I hid in my city apartment, I can destroy him." She looked at the eviction notice sitting on the counter. She picked it up, reading the terrifying red ink. Then she looked back at David. "You're a desperate man, David Miller, and I am a dead woman. Help me get my company back. Help me get into that apartment, and I will write you a check that will ensure Chloe never goes without a single thing for the rest of her life. I will make you a millionaire." David looked at the woman. She was bruised, broken, and wearing his flannel, but she was offering him the one thing he couldn't earn with a tow truck: a future for his daughter. 3 weeks, David said, his jaw tightening, "but we do this my way." The Escala on 4th Avenue was a monolith of glass and steel that pierced the gloomy, perpetual overcast of the Seattle skyline. It was the kind of building where the doormen wore tailored suits, and the private underground garage held more wealth than the GDP of several small nations. Victoria's penthouse occupied the entire 31st floor, accessible only by a biometric-locked private elevator. Inside the cramped, leaky trailer, the plan was born over a spread of hand-drawn blueprints sketched on the back of Chloe's old coloring book pages. Victoria, leaning heavily against the cheap laminate kitchen counter, pointed a trembling finger at the crude schematic. Richard isn't stupid, Victoria rasped, her voice still hoarse, a stark contrast to the sharp, commanding cadence of the CEO she truly was. He knows I keep physical backups. He won't trust his tech guys to wipe the cloud alone. He'll have Aegis private security contractors sitting on that apartment. My biometric access is definitely revoked or, worse, flagged to send a silent alarm to his phone the second the scanner reads my thumbprint. David, methodically cleaning the grease from his hands with a rag, nodded slowly. Then we don't use the front door. And you certainly aren't going in. I am. Victoria looked at him, her piercing blue eyes calculating. David, these aren't rent-a-cops. Aegis recruits ex-military and disgraced paramilitaries. If they catch you, they won't call the Seattle Police Department. They will make you disappear. I was the 10th Mountain Division, Victoria. I know how to handle guys who think carrying a Glock makes them invincible, David replied, his tone flat, devoid of bravado but heavy with dangerous competence. Besides, nobody looks twice at the guy in the high-visibility vest holding a clipboard. In a luxury building, the blue-collar workers are practically invisible. The execution began at 10:00 a.m. the following Tuesday. David had pawned his late wife's silver wedding band, a decision that physically hollowed his chest to buy a prepaid burner phone, a high-end earpiece, and a generic municipal water inspector's uniform. He parked his battered Ford F-450 tow truck 2 blocks away in a commercial loading zone, the hazard lights blinking a steady, rhythmic pulse in the morning drizzle. Walking into the gleaming marble lobby of the Escala, David felt the immediate crushing weight of the wealth disparity. The air smelled of expensive cedar polish and ozone. He approached the concierge, projecting the exhausted, bored demeanor of a city worker on his 4th job of the day. City Water Bureau, David muttered, sliding a forged work order across the pristine mahogany counter. We've got a pressure anomaly originating from the high-rise junction. Need access to the maintenance shafts on floors 30 and 31. The concierge, a young man with perfectly coiffed hair, barely glanced at the paper, wrinkling his nose at the faint smell of motor oil clinging to David's boots. Service elevator is down the hall to your left. Don't track mud on the carpets. Wouldn't dream of it, David grunted. The service elevator was slow, a stark contrast to the high-speed passenger lifts. In his ear, Victoria's voice crackled through the comms. She was sitting back in his trailer, monitoring his progress while keeping an eye on Chloe, who was blissfully watching cartoons in the next room. Okay, David, you're approaching the 31st floor, Victoria said, the tension palpable in her ear. The maintenance hatch opens directly into my private utility corridor. The security hub is to the left. The master suite is to the right. The drive isn't in the safe. Richard will have already cracked that. It's in the master bathroom. Behind the vanity mirror, there's a false tile. Copy that, David whispered, pulling a heavy steel wrench from his tool belt. The elevator chimed softly. David stepped out into the utility corridor. It was silent, save for the hum of massive HVAC units. He picked the lock on the maintenance door with practiced ease, easing it open just a fraction of an inch. The penthouse was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Puget Sound, framed by modern art that cost more than David would earn in 3 lifetimes. But the sheer luxury was marred by the absolute destruction within. Couch cushions were slashed, priceless vases shattered, and paintings torn from the walls. Richard's men had tossed the place. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the living room. I'm telling you, boss, it's not here. We've ripped the drywall out in the study. She didn't leave a damn thing. David held his breath, pressing his back against the cold wall. Footsteps approached the hallway. Heavy boots. Aegis. Victoria hissed in his ear. Get to the bathroom, now. Moving with lethal, silent grace, David slipped out of the corridor and darted into the shadows of the master suite. The bed was overturned, the silk sheets shredded. He slipped into the sprawling, marble-clad master bathroom. He found the vanity. Pressing his fingers against the bottom right corner of the mirror, he felt the faint click Victoria had described. The tile popped loose. Inside the dark cavity was a sleek, silver, Encrypted USB flash drive. He pocketed it. Got it. He breathed into the mic. Get out. Now, Victoria commanded. David turned to leave, but the bathroom door swung open, blocking his only exit. Standing in the doorway was a mountain of a man in tactical black. A suppressed Heckler & Koch USP gripped loosely in his right hand. The contractor's eyes locked onto David's water inspector uniform. A cruel smirk spreading across his scarred face. Well, the Aegis guard rumbled, raising the weapon. City Water must be paying really well these days for you to be stealing from the dead. David didn't hesitate. Military instincts, dormant for years, roared to life. Before the guard could level the pistol, David hurled the heavy steel wrench with terrifying velocity. It caught the man square in the sternum, cracking ribs and forcing a sharp exhalation of breath. The shot went wild, thudding silently into the ceiling plaster. David closed the distance in a fraction of a second. He grabbed the contractor's gun arm, twisting it violently upward until the shoulder popped, sending the weapon clattering across the marble floor. The guard roared in pain, throwing a massive left hook that caught David in the ribs, right where a normal man would have folded. David grunted, tasting copper, but he pivoted, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. As the giant crashed to the floor, David drove his knee into the man's solar plexus, followed by a brutal, precise strike to the carotid artery. The guard's eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Gasping for air, David leaned against the vanity. His ribs screamed in protest, a dark bruise already forming beneath his jumpsuit. David? What happened? I heard a scuffle. Victoria's voice panicked in his ear. We're good, David choked out, wiping a streak of blood from his lip. But your uncle's dogs are definitely home. I'm leaving. He retrieved his wrench, left the unconscious man on the floor, and slipped out through the service elevator just as shouts erupted from the living room. By the time Aegis security locked down the building, the beat-up Ford F-450 was already blending into the heavy, miserable Seattle traffic, heading south, carrying the single piece of evidence that could bring a billionaire empire to its knees. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering the thin aluminum roof of the trailer like a drumline. Inside, the only light came from the blue glow of a cheap Best Buy laptop. Victoria sat at the tiny kitchen table, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a desperate, frantic energy. The encrypted drive was plugged in. A progress bar inched across the screen. Decrypting. 87%. 91%. David sat opposite her, an ice pack pressed to his bruising ribs. He was cleaning his old army issue, Colt M 1911. The metallic snick-clack of the slide, the only sound competing with the storm outside. Chloe was asleep in her room, blissfully unaware that the shadows of her father's world were growing darker by the minute. This is it, Victoria whispered, her eyes glued to the screen as the bar hit 100%. Folders cascaded across the desktop. Ledgers, offshore account routing numbers, wire transfer receipts. He's been funneling corporate capital through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Hundreds of millions of dollars into illegal arms manufacturing. He wasn't just stealing from the company, David. He was funding private wars. This is enough to put Richard away for life. And it entirely nullifies his claim to the board. David looked at the screen, then at Victoria. The bruising on her face was fading, revealing the sharp, striking features of a woman who was born to rule boardrooms, not hide in trailer parks. Yet, over the last few days, he had seen a different side of her. He had seen her read bedtime stories to Chloe, her cold corporate exterior melting away to reveal a deep, guarded warmth. The proxy vote is in 48 hours, David said, sliding a magazine into the pistol. We leak this to the press, and the board will have to freeze his ascension. No, Victoria said firmly. If we leak it to the press, Richard's lawyers will tie it up in litigation for years. He'll claim the files were doctored by hackers. The only way this works is if I walk into that boardroom on Thursday morning, alive, and drop this drive on the mahogany table in front of the entire executive committee. I have to look him in the eye when I take my company back. David sighed, rubbing his face. You're a dramatic woman, Victoria. I'm a CEO. she corrected with a faint, tired smile. It's practically a requirement. Suddenly, the laptop screen flickered. A command prompt window violently popped open, lines of red code scrolling at lightning speed. Victoria's blood ran cold. She stared at the screen in abject horror. "What is that?" David asked, his body tensing, instantly recognizing the shift in her demeanor. "A tracker," Victoria breathed, slamming the laptop shut and yanking the flash drive out. The encryption had a tripwire. The second I unlocked it, it sent a ping. They know exactly where we are. We have minutes, maybe less. David didn't ask questions. He didn't panic. He moved. "Get your shoes on," he commanded, sprinting toward Chloe's bedroom. He scooped the sleeping 7-year-old into his arms, wrapping her tightly in her favorite quilt. Chloe mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Shh, baby girl, we're going on a night drive. It's an adventure, okay?" Victoria grabbed her coat and the flash drive, her heart hammering against her healing ribs. They burst out the front door of the trailer, just as the blinding beams of high-intensity headlights cut through the torrential rain at the entrance of the trailer park. 2 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans were rolling in, moving with predatory stealth, their headlights snapping off as they approached. "Get in the truck! Get in the floorboard!" David hissed, shoving Victoria and Chloe into the cab of the massive Ford F-450. David threw himself into the driver's seat, twisting the ignition key. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a guttural, angry sound that shattered the quiet of the park. The Suburbans instantly flipped their headlights back on, hitting their sirens a harsh, illegal electronic wail. Men in tactical gear began pouring out of the vehicles before they even came to a complete stop, drawing weapons. "Hold on," David yelled. He didn't throw the truck into drive. He threw it into reverse. With a squeal of heavy tires on wet asphalt, the 5-ton tow truck shot backward, smashing through the flimsy wooden fence of the trailer park, fishtailing into the muddy alleyway behind the lot. Gunfire erupted. The deafening crack, crack, crack of suppressed automatic weapons echoed in the night. Bullets shattered the passenger side mirror and thudded into the reinforced steel flatbed of the tow truck. Victoria shielded Chloe on the floorboard, pressing the terrified child's face into her chest. "Keep your head down, sweetie." "I've got you," Victoria promised fiercely, realizing in that terrifying moment that she would die before she let anything happen to David's daughter. David slammed the transmission into drive, the massive dual rear wheels spinning for traction before catching the pavement. The truck surged forward, tearing out of the alley and onto the desolate main road. The 2 Suburbans were right behind them, their powerful V8 engines easily gaining on the heavy, sluggish tow truck. "They're too fast," Victoria yelled over the roar of the diesel engine, looking back through the shattered rear window. David checked his mirrors. The lead SUV was pulling up alongside the driver's side, a man leaning out the window with a submachine gun. "This truck has kept us fed for 5 years, David muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Time for it to pay out one last time." As the SUV pulled parallel, David didn't swerve away. He slammed his foot on the brake, letting the SUV surge inches ahead, and then he cranked the steering wheel hard to the left, burying his foot in the accelerator. The reinforced steel push bumper of the 5-ton tow truck slammed into the rear quarter panel of the Suburban. The laws of physics took over. The SUV spun wildly out of control on the slick, rain-soaked asphalt, flipping violently into the drainage ditch in a shower of sparks and shattered glass. But the second Suburban was still coming, ramming into the back of the tow truck. David's head slammed against the steering wheel. Blood trickled down his forehead, mirroring the injury Victoria had suffered days ago. Up ahead, David saw salvation. A narrow, reinforced concrete underpass for the old Seattle freight rail lines. The clearance was exactly 10 feet. The F-450, with its raised hydraulic winch tower, was 11 feet tall. "Brace yourselves," David roared. He didn't slow down. He hit the underpass at 70 miles an hour. The heavy steel boom of the tow truck slammed into the concrete overpass with a cataclysmic, deafening shriek of tearing metal. The impact ripped the entire flatbed and towing apparatus completely off the chassis of the truck, leaving it in a tangled, ruined heap of steel blocking the narrow tunnel. The second Suburban, blindingly pursuing them through the rain, had no time to stop. It slammed headfirst into the discarded wreckage of the tow truck bed, the explosion of airbags and crumpled metal echoing into the night. David's truck, now just a ruined, spark-dragging cab and front chassis, skidded to a halt on the other side of the tunnel. It hissed and died, a thick plume of black smoke pouring from the cracked radiator. Panting, bleeding, but alive, David looked down at the floorboard. Victoria was staring up at him, her eyes wide with shock and a profound, overwhelming gratitude. Chloe was crying softly, clinging to Victoria's shirt. David kicked his jammed door open. "Out! We have to move! They'll send more." They abandoned the ruined shell of the truck, disappearing into the cold, unforgiving Seattle rain. 2 hours later, they arrived at a dilapidated, cash-only Motel 6 near the Tacoma port. It smelled of stale smoke and bleach. David locked the flimsy deadbolt and slid down the wall. Utterly exhausted. He had lost his home, his truck, and his livelihood in a single night. Victoria laid a sleeping Chloe on the lumpy mattress, pulling the thin motel blanket over her. She walked over to David, kneeling beside him on the stained carpet. She reached out, gently wiping the blood from his forehead with the sleeve of her coat. "You lost everything tonight because of me," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. The billionaire CEO was crying. Real tears falling for a man she had met less than a week ago. David looked at her, his dark eyes tired but entirely devoid of regret. He glanced at his daughter sleeping safely on the bed, then back to Victoria. "I still have the only two things in this world that matter right now," David said softly. "My daughter, and the woman who is going to end Richard Sterling." Victoria nodded, her jaw setting with a newfound, terrifying resolve. The fear was gone. The hunted prey was dead. 48 hours, Victoria said, her eyes burning with the cold fire of vengeance. "We rest tonight. Tomorrow, we go to war." The mahogany doors of the Sterling Bancroft Logistics boardroom on the 50th floor overlooked the sprawling Seattle waterfront. At the head of the massive glass table sat Richard Sterling, casually adjusting his heavy platinum Rolex Daytona. He smiled at the 12 executive board members, perfectly projecting the image of a grieving but resolute uncle. In the wake of Victoria's tragic passing, Richard began, his voice dripping with rehearsed, faux sorrow. "We must stabilize our stock prices and reassure our global partners. The proxy vote today will officially consolidate my position as CEO and chairman." He reached for his Montblanc pen to sign the binding corporate resolution. He never touched it. The heavy oak double doors blew open with a deafening crash. 2 Aegis security contractors stumbled backward into the room, groaning in pain, violently shoved by David Miller. Dressed in a sharp-tailored black suit that barely hid his heavily bruised ribs, David stepped aside, his cold, unwavering gaze locking onto the remaining security personnel in the room. His hand rested casually near the bulge of his Colt M1911 under his jacket. He didn't say a word, but his posture screamed lethal intent. Then Victoria walked in. She wore a pristine, commanding white designer trench coat. Her blonde hair was pulled back sharply, and the faint, healing scar on her temple was the only sign of the mangled Mercedes and the muddy ravine that was supposed to be her grave. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Board members gasped, their chairs scraping violently against the polished hardwood. Richard's face drained of color. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost, his jaw working but producing no sound. "Victoria, that's impossible," the police said. "That I was swept downriver?" Victoria interrupted, her voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. She walked slowly, deliberately, to the head of the table. "I'm afraid my survival skills are vastly superior to your hitmen's mechanical skills, Uncle Richard." "Arrest them!" Richard screamed, his composure shattering. He pointed a trembling finger at David. "She's an imposter!" "Shoot them," The remaining Aegis guards hesitated, hands hovering over their holsters. "I wouldn't," David warned softly, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. Victoria reached into her coat and slammed the silver, encrypted USB drive onto the glass table. It cracked the tempered surface like a gunshot. "This contains the unredacted ledgers of your illegal Cayman Island shell companies," Victoria said, leaning over the table, trapping her uncle in her predatory gaze. "I didn't just bring it here for show. At 7:00 a.m., I sat down with the director of the Seattle FBI field office. By 8:00 a.m., my corporate contacts at JP Morgan Chase officially froze every single offshore asset you possess. And exactly 10 minutes ago, the Wall Street Journal published the entire dossier online." Richard collapsed back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of him as the distant, rising wail of police sirens echoed from the city streets below, growing louder by the second. The empire he had killed for was crumbling into ash. "You're done, Richard," Victoria whispered. 3 months later, the bitter Seattle rain was a distant memory. David stood on the sunlit cedar deck of a sprawling $5 million waterfront estate on Mercer Island. He watched Chloe laugh joyously as she chased a golden retriever puppy across the manicured lawn. Her asthma was completely managed by the top specialists at Seattle Children's Hospital, all funded by a massive, private trust in her name. The sliding glass door opened behind him. Victoria stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to David, standing close beside him as they watched Chloe play. "I owe you my life, David," Victoria said softly, the corporate ice entirely melted from her bright blue eyes. David took a sip of the coffee, smiling at the billionaire CEO who was no longer a stranger, but family. "We saved each other, Victoria. That's just what partners do." What an incredible journey. From a freezing ravine to the top of a billionaire empire, David proved that true heroism always wins in the end. Did you expect that explosive boardroom twist? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this thrilling story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life drama and suspenseful tales.